Thank you. Don't worry, I'm hilarious.
Born in 1990, Bo Burnham came up in the industry in the late aughts doing musical comedy right here on YouTube. This was at the beginning of YouTube's life cycle, like the year he came up was the year that Google bought them. But Bo Burnham was a genuine comedy phenom. He officially released his first EP at 17 and filmed his first comedy special, a Comedy Central Presents, the day after his 18th birthday. In an AV Club interview in 2009, when his Comedy Central Presents special was coming out, Bo said that the impulse to put his songs on YouTube was simple and not really fame related at all. I had written these songs and I wanted to show them to my brother who's in college. Very Vlogbrothers of him, which makes sense because that's what YouTube was for back in the day. It wasn't a platform for fame. Not yet, anyway. Part 1. Ha ha ha. Classic comedy. So, while Bo's existence as a musical comedian wasn't new by any means, like Tim mentioned, had a nearly decade-long career before Bo burst into the American scene, and at the same time the Flight of the Conchords were actively taking the American comedy scene by storm, Bo does show up first when you Google musical comedians, if that means anything for his general popularity to this day. I will say, however, that Bo Burnham is a who, to use the parlance of one of my favorite podcasts, Who Weekly. Like, he's well known in the comedy world, and even a little bit outside of it, especially as his career has gone on to be more mainstream film and television, but he's not Dane Cook, and he never was, even at the height of his career. Like, my mom might know who he is, but that's just because I was an asshole teenager who made her listen to everything in the car, and she just wanted me to be happy. Like, there is absolutely no reason for my mom to know and kind of enjoy who 21 Pilots is as a band, but she does, and that's my cross to bear. And Bo, aside from having some genuinely catchy comedy songs, was certainly doing the types of jokes that were super prevalent at the time in the late aughts and early 2010s. Some of it really leaned into, especially later in his career, the surrealist comedy that has kind of become like internet comedy, but some of it was kind of exactly what you would expect from that time period and his general age, race, and sexuality demographic, aka a straight white teenage boy, before 2010, or 2021, if we're being totally honest. So, with that in mind, let's talk about the racism and homophobia that is very prevalent in every single one of Bo's specials. So Bo's brand of racist humor really relies on this kind of like baseline of liberal white guy humor, as in, ha ha ha, isn't it wild and funny that a very liberal white guy who should definitely know better is saying all of this brazenly racist shit? Classic comedy! Which really just puts all of that humor and all of those jokes, even in the middle of songs and bits that aren't about that, on the shock value end of the comedy scale. Things that are looking for uncomfortable laughs rather than just like actual laughs from his mostly white audience. In a New Yorker profile, when his first feature, 8th Grade, was coming out a few years ago, he spoke to his mom about the original videos that kind of inspired a lot of his original Comedy Central Presents material. And he said, quote, "It was typical 2006 shock jock offensive comedy done by a 16-year-old without any tact." Which is true, but I would also say he still kind of kept doing it, even when it was no longer the 2006 shock jock offensive comedy and he was no longer 16 years old. And that's a problem. All of which is to say that it's not like he wasn't doing comedy as well that was poking fun at like actual racists. Like, you can take a look at Klan Cookout to some degree and Straight White Man from his first and his last special/recordings respectively. But like it's been said before, if racists are laughing with you, you're probably doing something wrong. And the same can and should be said for the homophobia that's kind of baked into Bo's comedy as well. Like, literally all 4 of his filmed specials have at least one, if not more than one, song or general joke where the punchline, the point of the joke, the point of everything existing, is either him generally saying or somebody calling him the F slur. This one is a bit trickier to pull apart just because we know where Bo sits on the race thing. He's white, making racist jokes. But I would say it's also pretty clear that Bo has internalized a lot of the homophobia that was seemingly thrown at him throughout his life. Despite not being actually queer himself, at least as far as the public knows. So on that level, I understand where wanting to reclaim something traumatic that was thrown at you comes from. But the fact remains that it's not his to reclaim. And it's not really fair to make an audience of people, especially a portion of whom are queer, have to relive through their trauma just because you need to process yours publicly. And sure, I find a lot, well, some, maybe not a lot, but some of that material to be very meaningful. But it's definitely in spite of everything and not because of it. So I don't want to seem like I'm excusing any of it, especially not the racism, which wasn't good then and has aged like milk in the 15 years since he started releasing comedy in a public space. I just think it's important to generally bring up that I do have a lot of issues with Bo's comedy because I'm going to talk about what the rest of the comedy means to me, which happens to be a lot, as you will hear about in the next section. And the racism and the homophobia is a big part of the legacy of Bo's humor, whether I like it or not, and certainly whether he likes it or not. Part 2. Goodbye Sadness, Hello Jokes. I was in high school when the Comedy Central Presents Bo Burnham first aired. I'm not totally sure that I watched it while it was actually airing for the first time, or if I just caught it in reruns, but I watched it. Eventually. I am also about 80% sure that I have some kind of undiagnosed depression and anxiety or anxiety. I don't know. It's undiagnosed. It's a mystery, and that I have had that since I was a kid. This has always been exacerbated by the fact that I moved around a lot when I was younger, and while I kept moving back to my hometown in North Carolina, everything was weird every single time I did that. Like, I moved for 6 months to Wilmington before moving back to Asheville, and then I moved to Seattle for 7th and 8th grade before moving back to Asheville, and then I moved to Montana for 10th and 11th grade before moving back to Asheville, and then I just ended up going to college about an hour outside of Asheville at Western Carolina University. But every single time I moved back to my hometown, my entire friend group changed. It was enough time. Childhood is weird. We were all different people. I needed new friends every single time. I had a best friend from my freshman year of high school, but everybody else cycled, moved out, etc. And the kicker is that that best friend was actually older than me. So when I moved back to North Carolina from Montana for my senior year, she was in college already. So I didn't really hang out with a lot of people outside of school, which was fine. I was much more of an indoor kid, and this was kind of the height of when me binge watching DVDs started. The binge watching thing came from my mom also doing it, and not having friends around to judge my media consumption. Like, I used to be really into Scrubs, and I would quite regularly on many occasions, watch an entire season of Scrubs in a single sitting in a single day. It helped that it was a half hour, but that's probably not good in retrospect. Anyway, when I first saw Comedy Central Presents Bo Burnham, I was in what I would call a depressive episode, and I immediately changed the channel. It did not in any way seem like it was going to be something that would help my mood, but nothing else was on, and I eventually made my way back to Comedy Central and just watched it. And shocking to me at the time, though probably not to you watching this video now, it helped somehow. I ended up buying the physical CD, which also had a copy of the special on it, and got really obsessed with Bo Burnham and his comedy. His second album, Words, 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 which was technically his first special, came out on Comedy Central while I was a freshman in college at Western. The second album, I would argue, is where Bo really starts getting introspective in a very personal way, which was deeply appealing, especially given the next part of my life. So I bought the CD the day the special premiered, and then 2 days later, my dad died. I don't think I have actually thought about the timing of that special coming out and my dad dying and kind of my general media consumption around that time as it related to my dad's death until I was working on this video. Like, it hadn't properly processed for me that, like, these things actually did happen all at once. So that's cool. So I got on a plane, I flew to Montana because that's where my dad is from, went to my dad's funeral, and I legitimately only listened to one thing, which was Words, 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 and I only watched one thing, which was Marble Hornets, actually, not Words, Words, Words. I was really obsessed with Marble Hornets at the time, so wild coping mechanisms. I'm sure that hasn't done anything to my brain. And then a year later, almost to the day, which is extremely serendipitous and I don't know what to do with that information, Bo Burnham came to my college on tour and I got to see him live. So this was before What came out, his third comedy album, his technical second special, and he was workshopping material for that show. We got to see what eventually became the opening of that show, which is a truly remarkable piece of just like comedy, like physical comedy, and I think about it a lot, actually. Like a lot. And he also snapped a guitar string right at the beginning of the show, slicing his hand open, and bled on the grand piano every single time he played a song, which, as you would imagine, was a lot. So I don't really remember a lot from that actual show other than those like 2 things and like 1 or 2 other things, but it was extremely cathartic in its own way to have the album come out, have my dad die, and then on the anniversary of both of those things, get to see Bo. And Bo's comedy, especially as he grew up, I think has really showcased his ability to cut right to the core of mental health, but funny, and sometimes not funny. Like sometimes with just a phrase in the middle of a stupid song with a gimmick, he'd perfectly encapsulate the millennial mental health crisis that we're all kind of still currently living through. And sometimes it's enough to be seen and have those feelings put into words. Words. Part 3. I'm not honest for a second up here. It often feels, especially in his later work, like Bo Burnham is having a crisis on stage when he performs, which is by his own design. That need to process things publicly that I mentioned earlier, sometimes it's a good thing, actually. In that New Yorker profile, which was done by Michael Schulman, Bo talked about when he first started having panic attacks, which was later in his life. His first one was in 2013, during the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and then he just kept having more. On stage, in front of a large crowd of people, thousands of people have watched him lose it completely on stage over the course of his career since then. And Schulman noted how visceral 8th grade as a film felt in terms of nailing how adolescence feels, especially when you're living through it, which agreed. But Bo's response, I think, is really indicative of something. I wish life was a little less visceral. I'm getting better at it. The worst thing about having a panic attack to me is that I feel more alive than I have ever felt, which, same. But also, that is such a specifically on-brand thing for Bo to say and to feel, I guess, and to put into the world in such visceral words. When you have anxiety, not just about generally performing, but about maintaining your societal clout in a world where everything comes and goes so quickly, like on social media, what is there to really do but panic about it? I think part of the reason I kept gravitating to Bo Burnham's comedy is because of that. There's a tug of war between how you feel and how you must present yourself in order to maintain your life in a healthy and productive way, especially as an artist on social media. And social media generally has made so many of us just want to perform. Like, I'm literally making a YouTube video right now. And to be able to make our living, make our money, our career, our livelihood off those performed pieces that we're posting. That's not particularly healthy. And the further we go down the social media and tech rabbit holes, the less it becomes a freeing form of expression, like how Bo was originally making his comedy videos, and more it becomes a prison of our own making, which is why Bo retired in the first place.
Social media, it's just the market's answer to a generation that demanded to perform. So the market said, here, perform everything to each other all the time for no reason. It's prison. It's horrific. It is performer and audience melded together. What do we want more than to lie in our bed at the end of the day and just watch our life as a satisfied audience member? I know very little about anything, but what I do know is that if you can live your life without an audience, you should do it.
So it's very possible that if Art is Dead didn't exist on Words, 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 that Bo would have just been a musical comedian who got pretty big for a while, had a few big songs that got caught in people's heads, and not much more. And that would have been fine, you know? But that song is such a deep exploration of imposter syndrome as a creative person, something that a lot of artists struggle with, that I think it has cemented itself onto the psyche of a lot of young people, especially young creatives. There's a reason why it's been on my Spotify on repeat list for months now, after all, and why it keeps coming back. Well, that and the TikTok of it all. Because as the form of social media changes, it seems like Bo is a constant. He was on Vine, I'm sure he was on Musical.ly, who can remember? And he is certainly on TikTok. Well, he's not on TikTok. He was on Vine, but he's not on TikTok, but his sounds are. With the rise of just generally using sounds on TikTok, people are rediscovering certain Bo songs like Art is Dead, and what I would say is the funny version of Art is Dead, which is Left Brain, Right Brain from What. And both of those songs are in his top 3 on Spotify right now, in positions 1 and 3 respectively. Left Brain, Right Brain is extremely interesting to me because it feels like this more surrealist, weird idea of what mental illness often feels like. The plot of the sketch / song, it's like a combo of both, is that a computer has pulled Bo's brain apart basically into the superego and the id, the pragmatic and the instinctual, only to have both superego and id realize that they better serve Bo if they're working together in harmony. This piece is less about the struggle of imposter syndrome like Art is Dead, but trust me, that idea comes back a lot in Bo's art. He clearly struggles, as many creative people do, with the dream of making their living being creative. Of people loving your art enough and paying for your art enough that that's just what you get to do for a living. But it also butts heads with knowing and recognizing that there are so many people in the world who need money and resources. That the money and resources allocated to you and your art, especially in a mainstream space, could be better spent elsewhere by other people. Part 4. We Think We Know You. In 2013, The Independent said, quote, he, as in Bo, could be the quintessential comedian for a generation growing up online. But to know a large community of people and to be known by some degree by them in return is hard. It's emotional and it's often brutal. And because we, as fans, can never actually know the object of our fandom, enter the parasocial relationship. Coined in the 1950s, parasocial describes the relationship between the audience and the performer, where because the audience sees the performer repeatedly, and in the age of social media, often in a more unregulated kind of way, the audience believes that they are friends, or at least somewhat closer than the average person, to the performer. It's the idea of standing a person, but in more academic terms. Miss Lola and Broe Deschanel have both done really great videos where they've talked at length about parasocial relationships and fame. They're both extremely good, and I will link some videos down below in the description. You should check them out. They're all excellent. Where the parasocial relationship relates to Bo Burnham, I think is pretty evident in his shows, especially after his first special. Between what would be traditionally called heckling, but I would call sexual harassment. Ain't it fun to get sexually harassed over and over at shows, on stage, in front of people? Often while a show is being filmed, so actually it's going to be in front of even more people, and forever. That definitely wouldn't mess with your psyche and how you view yourself at all. No siree. But between that and the actual musical comedy that he started doing after the Comedy Central Presents, I'd say that it's fair to say that the relationship Bo had with a lot of his fans through social media fucked with him as his career only grew. What was once a fun thing to show his brother funny bits became a career, and that career wasn't just marketed on social media. It existed because of social media and through social media. There was even more of a fan claim to his success because he became popular on a fan-driven site and not just through the usual comedy channels. And while it's not the case now, his entire livelihood at one point was based on this parasocial relationship that social media ultimately cultivates. The more that fans thought that they knew and understood him, the bigger his star would get. And I'm sure that there were times, my guess is probably in 2013 when he started having his panic attacks on stage, that he felt like his career would die if he didn't give that parasocial relationship everything, despite wanting the separation that so many artists before social media are given. But also, that reading is probably my parasocial relationship with Bo Burnham coming through. And I think it's a mix of how I think I would feel if I skyrocketed into that kind of spotlight-driven fame seemingly overnight on social media. But I would also argue that me being able to project my own anxiety as an artist into Bo's music and comedy is part of this ever-continuing parasocial relationship that people have with him and his work. Like, that's a big reason why I latched onto him and why I, at some point, felt like I probably had a pretty intense parasocial relationship with Bo Burnham. I shouldn't call him Bo. I realize that now. That's weird. And I know that I'm never going to be friends with Bo Burnham. I may never meet him ever again, aside from vaguely seeing him when he came to see a movie at ArcLight, which is the first job I had when I lived in LA. Rip. And I may never work with him in any capacity, even though I would love to, because he is so interesting as an artist. Like, I have no illusions about what my relationship with Bo Burnham is like. I'm gonna go listen to his silly little songs and get in my feelings about my artistic integrity. Okay? But his comedy has always helped me deal with my creative anxiety, my general anxiety, and for the most part, it makes me genuinely happy. Part 5. Are you happy? Bo Burnham's final comedy special for the foreseeable future is entitled Make Happy, and it ends with maybe one of my favorite pieces he has ever written and performed, called Are You Happy? It's a quiet piece that he leaves the stage to perform, and it's the first moment of its kind in Bo Burnham's overall work. It asks a simple question: are you happy? He's asking the audience, but he's also asking himself, both as a performer, but also as a person. He muses that he could probably be happy if he didn't panic whenever he was unhappy. Mood. That he's unhappy because he feels like he's entitled to have a life where he's happy. Mood. And it zips around from things that a typical father would say, like, you wouldn't want it even if you got it, and killer Bo Burnham lines like, hey ma, look, I made it. Are you happy? And that's the question of our lives, right? Especially in America, where one of our inalienable rights written into our Declaration of fucking Independence is the pursuit of happiness. That as creatives, and certainly as just regular people, we have the right to try to be happy. So, are you happy? Do you know why you're unhappy? And do you know how to be happy? Would you know when you got it? And would you want it even if you did? Do you know how to be happy with your work or your relationships or your life as a whole? What does it take for you to be happy? And you'll be shocked to find out that the answer is actually different for everyone. But for Bo Burnham, it seems like being able to make art on his own terms without quite as much pressure as his comedy career seemingly put on him was at least a first step in him trying to be happy. And I think, one creative to another, as far as lessons go, that one seems like a pretty good one.